So good morning. All of us with our organizations are trying to figure out how to deal with the massive volume of data we have to effectively make decisions with our organizations. I look forward to listening to today's conversation and learning what we can do at NC State to make sure that we are preparing our students to have a great future in our data-rich world that we are living in. Welcome everyone today to our session. This is the third in a series that we call the PNC Thought Leadership Series. PNC Bank partnered with NC State to bring together academics and industry leaders to address issues that are confronting our world. I want to thank PNC Bank for really helping us in what we are trying to do, which is bring together our academics, partners across our campus, to make sure that we think and do. We have many people here today. We have faculty, students, staff, alumni, as well as team members from PNC Bank. We appreciate you all being here today. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our partner, Jim Hansen, who is the regional president for PNC Bank. Jim oversees the philanthropic and business activities of PNC Bank, covering the eastern half of North and South Carolina, ranging from the Research Triangle Park to the Outer Banks to the South Carolina Low Country. Jim also, we are proud to say, is an alumnus of the Poole College of Management and great friend to our university and college. Jim previously served on the board of advisors for the Poole College of Management and currently serves on the board of visitors for NC State University. Thank you, Jim, for all you do for NC State and the Poole College. Would everybody please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jim Hansen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. It is great to be on campus here this morning. Appreciate the introduction. And as Frank touched on, we think about, we started a partnership with NC State University more in depth a few years ago. Things like this morning are what's so special about it. And, the partnership in some ways is very obvious, with a branch in the middle of Talley Student Center, which is wonderful to come back to as an alumni. It was very different when I was here. But then also it's items such as this, in which we get out of Nelson Hall and we get into the Talley Student Center and reach across campus and bring thoughts and ideas and conversations. Because the reality is, in our business, and I was a business and finance major with a statistics minor, and went on, MBA, but the reality is that business reaches across these areas of learning, and we have to think about that in everything we do each day. And so it's great to be a partner and really help students and have this conversation. So what do we want to accomplish today? Business analytics, which is a hot topic and a hot word out there we hear, but I think each of us need to better understand what it does and how it affects different industries. And so today we'll have business professionals talk about how they utilize analytics in decision making and their aspects of business. We'll also look at trends through the lens of analytics and corporate strategies and university-wide academic disciplines. For students joining, we hope this sparks interest and understanding and how this can apply in your learning here at NC State. And what a place to do it, right? NC State with the science, math, and business focus, and technology and engineering, and where we can bring all that together in one conversation. And so we look forward to the ideas and thoughts that we'll have this morning. There'll be plenty of time for question and answers, so please be thinking about that as we go through the morning. And so let's get us started. For our panel, and I believe we have the full crew. We're missing still Rob. His business analytics and his map didn't get him here yet this morning, but he's working on it, so he'll get that corrected. But so Rob will be here and come in hot. He's on the way, and he'll jump on stage. But Rob's a research data scientist and program manager with RTI. But we wanted to jump in and get going. We'll have Oida Coleman with SAS. She's a vice president of research and development. we have Bill Rand, who's the Poole College of Management Associate Professor of Marketing, and our moderator, Sherry Fowler, the Professor of Practice in Information Technology and Business Analytics with Poole College of Management. So please welcome our speakers, and let's get started. Thank you.
I feel so far away from them. I'm not sure if that's a good thing. There you go. That works. That works. Well, thank you very much to Frank and to Jim for that warm introduction. And thank you for all of you in attendance. As I look out over the audience, I see former students, I see current students, some of my colleagues at the Poole College of Management, and certainly some fantastic alumni. So thank you to all of you for being here today. Thank you also to our panelists, to Bill and to Oida, and then Rob, as was mentioned, is on his way. So we're very excited to talk about this topic today. And we've, in conversation, talked about some important subtopics related to the field of analytics and the impact that big data has on decision making. So I would like to start by addressing a few questions to the panelists, and then we'll open it up to general questions that all of you may have. So, Oida, I'd like to begin with you, if I may.
Sure.
You represent SAS, you represent the flagship organization in analytics, and so I thought it would be good if we started with a couple of definitions. So, can you tell us what exactly is analytics, and how can it help an organization today make better decisions?
All right. First of all, thank you for the invitation to participate on this panel. It is an honor to be here and to represent SAS and to discuss the topic of analytics. It is something that between that and big data and all of the topics we'll be discussing today, I think is a very timely and relevant conversation. And to talk about analytics, I also think it's really appropriate to have this conversation and to ask the question because SAS as a company began here on NC State's campus with the purpose of analyzing agricultural data. So it started out as a project to help deal with all of the data and to be able to predict the impact of climate and weather on crops. And so from that, the company began with the goal of analyzing data. So in terms of definition, really it comes down to describing it as analytics turns data into information. It helps you make better decisions. So in the context of business analytics, it takes the data information that a company has and helps them make data-driven decisions. It's helping them to analyze trends in terms of sales and revenue. It helps them in the context of social media, analyze and determine what the sentiment of their customer base is. So in a nutshell, it's just taking information to make better decisions. If A happens, then B. And so in moving away from just reactive, it's also predictive. And moving forward is not just looking back and analyzing what has happened, but the area of, and we'll hear talk more about it, is being able to anticipate and to understand what's coming to be able to react or to move forward in a predictive manner.
Very good. Thank you. That's awesome. And Bill, to kind of follow up on that, maybe we can set a definition. What exactly is big data? Where did it come from? And why do we have all this hype around it?
So, of course, there's a bunch of definitions floating out about big data. If you go back to some of the earliest definitions of looking at like the volume, velocity, and variety of the data is constantly changing. Honestly, I think that really when we talk about it from a business analytics perspective, what we mean by big data is the fact that we're integrating, I think, multiple sources of data in new ways to help us make decisions that we couldn't make based upon, say, a simple spreadsheet or a simple kind of data set that we had before, right? And so we're talking about the technologies that we have available to us now that allow us to bring those data together in almost real-time decision-making processes to help us really assess what's going on. You know, from a kind of a technical definition to some extent, I do have a computer science background, so I always like to go there at some point. But I think of big data as any time when the data is large enough that it won't fit in the memory of a machine, right? But I don't think that's a very useful definition. I think thinking about it instead from the perspective of what kinds of new insights can we gather that use technologies beyond the simple spreadsheet, beyond the simple just adding up numbers and plotting a straight line. When are those useful for us to help making decision making? And at that point, I'm willing to call it big data.
Do you think there's hype around it that's not justified today? Would you speak to that?
I mean, of course. I think big data, AI, analytics, a lot of these terms that are out there. I just saw a talk from a friend of mine at Oxford University, and he basically said that, you know, half the applications of AI in marketing aren't actually AI, right? They're just basically people calling what they were doing before AI, for instance. And I think the same is true for big data in a lot of cases, right? I don't really care too much about what the name is, right? I don't think that's terribly important. I think what's more important is, are these tools, all these techniques, helping us make better decisions than we could before? And if they are, then we should adopt them and we should use them and we should move forward. And if they're not, we should abandon them and we should invest a lot of resources into something that's not helping us improve our business, right, or our organizations.
Yes.
So can I add
Absolutely.
something to that? And I agree totally with what you said. The one factor that comes into play now is, if we think about everybody in this room and everything that you have, all of your cell phone, your Apple Watches and everything, all of the receivers, that it's just, everything generates data now. Everything, there is so much, from your refrigerator to your car to your mobile phone, you're on social media, everything, every transaction or thing that we do during the day generates data. And so really the hype is around the volume and the fact that there is so much that is being generated, and it's, instead of being numbers in a spreadsheet, it's unstructured data. And we'll probably talk about that. It's easy to analyze numbers, but when you have images, you know, from security cameras that are capturing people and faces and things that happen, it's all of that is what's building up the hype, really, of the big data.
And what I would quickly add on to it is not just the simple, like, here now we can process images, right? But we can take those images that someone's maybe, you know, posting to social media accounts in the public, and we can pull it in with our traditional CRM transaction data, for instance, and combine them together to try and figure out, what does this person really want from the company next, right? What stage of life are they at? How can we improve the next thing that we're going to offer to them, the next product or service that we're going to present to them, to really make it what they need right now? And so combining those data sets, I think, is almost more important than the actual data that's in all of them separately.
Exactly.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. So we are an educational institution here at NC State, so I would like to bring up the topic of what do each of you consider to be the essential components or skill sets that a business student in particular might need to have surrounding this area of data analytics?
You're starting.
Okay, sure. So, I mean, I view the business analytics stack, if you will, as going from the raw data at the bottom to kind of the business insight at the top, right? And students need to know parts of every layer of that stack along the way, right? How to import, how to look at the data, how to clean the data, how to store it in a good framework. And then, of course, how to model it, how to analyze it, how to use statistics and computer science to understand what that data is telling you about it. But then, most critically, I think they also need the ability to kind of make an insight from it, to garner knowledge from that, to translate what those models mean to a business question, right? To a business operation or decision making, right? The data and the models themselves are almost useless if they aren't actually translated from that raw data into business insights, right? And one way to think of that stack, if you will, is that a business analytics professional is concerned more with the top and kind of drills down to the bottom, like a little triangle kind of going that way. Whereas someone who's more of a data analytics professional, for instance, might be concerned more with the bottom, with the raw data, and then has a little bit less insight at the top levels, right? And I think that a lot of the teams that are out there nowadays that are doing the best work in this space are combinations of those different kinds of skill sets.
Yeah. So I would add, in addition to those technical skills, the soft skills of just curiosity. I mean, because really to do well is you have to be curious about what insights do I want to gain from this data. What I think about for the students, when I think about when I was in school, if I look back to the class that probably made the most sense to where I am to be in the quality, the software quality space, is logic theory. I mean, seriously, it's just down to the basic of understanding and being able to solve a problem and understanding the logic and to be able to ask the question of why. And to me, that if to be successful, in addition to the technical skills, but just having the curiosity and just the why. Don't be satisfied with the first answer that you come to of the answer. It's like, okay, but why? Okay, get to the next layer. Why? The 5 whys is what we call is the important thing within the quality space. Is understanding really what is it that I want to gain from this information, and what answers am I seeking, and what are the insights, and what am I going to do with it even after I get those answers.
Great, thank you. So let's switch gears just a little bit, and I'd like for you to address this one specifically. How do you handle the interaction of privacy with analytics?
When we were talking about this question, and since we received a list of questions, it's like, man, the media is just full of fodder to answer this question over the last couple of weeks. So when I think about analytics and privacy, the things that come to my mind is really, it's about ethics and it's about bias and privacy. I see all those things together. And what I mean by that is recently there's been a lot of news stories, just even over this week with the Apple card in Goldman Sachs and the bias that in the algorithm of when a couple would apply for the Apple card, the female always received a lower credit limit than the male in the household, and even though that the female may have had a higher credit score. And so the reason I use that example is in the UK they have passed a bill called General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. And the reason that's important is if you are a UK citizen, you have right to the access of the information of why a decision was made based on an algorithm. And it's what they're referring to as the right to know. And so if you, and what that comes with it comes with the the right to understand how data about you is being used, and that's the privacy. So is companies have the right to use the data, but as a citizen, you have the right to understand how that data is being used to make a decision. And so when things and bias comes into play, it's important to understand the data, how a decision is made, as we were talking about, especially as a governmental unit, if someone is using information about you, you should understand the rules of the game. Every other area in life, we kind of have a clear understanding of the rules of the game and how decisions are made. But when you have complex algorithms, it's kind of difficult to understand how those decisions are being made. And so when it comes to that, then that's kind of how the ethics comes into play, is that there should not be malice or ill intent in making those decisions. Our biases come into play in terms of how some decisions are made, in terms of how we write and validate the algorithms. And so it's important to understand why, how, and understand the privacy. Google, that was another example that was in the news, how they are really collecting health data about us. And with them recently buying Fitbit, if they are already collecting that information and the users of the platform didn't know that the data was being collected, it's just really becoming our right to understand the decisions, our right to understand the data that's being collected behind us. All of those things into ethics comes into play. Mm-hmm. And so that's a really big field moving forward, is data ethics. It's how businesses, how organizations will leverage in the information that they have about all of us.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all the things that we mentioned are very important, and in fact with the Google example, I think that's a great example where they were apparently working with a set of Catholic hospitals to collect a bunch of data about the patients, and you could imagine all the great information and insights we could gain from those electronic health records, right? If now all of a sudden we have all this data on hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of patients, right, collected in one database, that's a trove of research for medical scientists, for people interested in that area, right? But at the same time, right, we have to make sure that those companies are accountable for that data that they're collecting it in a proper way, that they're anonymizing it properly when necessary, that it's being treated in appropriate ways, right? And so I really think that what this comes down to from the firm perspective is to make sure that you're establishing a relationship with the customer and that you're not violating that relationship with the customer, right? Like, we need to move away from the notion that it's like full privacy or no privacy at all, right? There's a conversation to be had there. Giving up some of our private information, which we do with every transaction that we possibly have, is almost a necessity to move forward, right? And that the customers expect you to return something to them in exchange for them giving you some of that private information, right? And we need to start to make sure that we're honoring that relationship, honoring that this contract that is implied when we enter into transactions with the firm, right? And as long as you don't violate that implied contract, that implied trade, and sometimes it's not even implied, it's spelled out, right? Transaction, I think in many cases the customers are going to be okay, right? Yeah. Now, of course, I'm a big fan of looking at individual level models of people, right? And consumers are very rich in the heterogeneity in which they encompass these things. And so at times, right, some customers are going to be more upset than others, but you got to kind of work to find out whatever you can do to solve everything, to ameliorate as many customers as possible in that space.
Great, very good. Welcome, Rob.
Hey,
So glad to have you here.
Thank you.
We'll give you a moment to catch your breath.
right.
I'll
I
ask
do
Bill
appreciate it.
one question here in addition. So Bill, you're an avid researcher, and I would like for you to address how research has changed in recent years because of big data, artificial intelligence, and perhaps even something that today we call deep learning.
Yeah. So historically, the business academic world, at least I can speak to that, has been dominated by kind of an econometric mindset or a more statistical kind of mindset. And I think that what we're starting to see a little bit of is the infusion of kind of more machine learning and computer science approaches to understanding large data, which I think is great, right? Because as you know, if you look in the past, right, in many cases, the kind of data that was studied in your average business journal maybe had an N of like 1,000, right? 1,000 data points, or 10,000 if you're really lucky, right? Data points to look at. But now, with the growth of some of the new computer science methods and things like that, we're able to look at millions and tens of millions of data points, right? And really deal with data at the same level that companies are handling it at, right? And I think that specifically the inclusion of techniques like deep learning and neural nets has allowed us to quickly analyze large unstructured data sets, something we had mentioned earlier, that we weren't able to analyze before. For instance, I'm working with a student where we're looking at thousands of pictures on Instagram, tens of thousands actually, and how they influence consumer decision making, right? How they influence the ability for consumers to like a product, to engage with a product, and how that eventually leads to transactions, to actual sales, right? And that was data that was essentially not even touched in the last, say, 3 to 5 years, right? Like it hasn't been long that we've been able to start analyzing that data. And I think that now we're going to have much better insights to share with businesses and organizations about how do pictures affect people, right? And pictures, we know, have around 3 to 5 times the engagement rate of pure text posts on a lot of context, right? So trying to understand those things that are much more important, let alone video, right? I think is going to be critical going forward to understanding marketing and to understanding business operations as a whole.
Very good, thank you. So, Rob, you're with RTI International,
Yes, that's right.
a large organization that's been in the Raleigh and Durham area for a long time.
Right.
And so you're a data scientist. So I guess I would like for you to address the question, what are use cases for analytics for good? How can we use analytics to sort of perpetuate good in our cultures and indeed throughout organizations, but at a higher level, at the societal level?
Yeah, so do folks around, I did see actually some RTI employees, so I know there's a couple people who know what RTI is. Show of hands, do folks know in the room, familiar with RTI? Okay, so like, a minority, but a good minority. Yeah, so a quick overview, just to give you a sense of like where my answer is coming from. So RTI is like one of the founding, I think the founding institution of the Research Triangle Park. Now, you know, we just had our 60th year anniversary today, and we work in a ton of different domains across, you know, from international development, environmental research, public health, do a ton of public health work. And I'd say that 80% of our work is the contracts for the federal government, and then the other portion is for foundations and commercial activities. So in terms of data for social good, I work in the Center for Data Science, which is a kind of a center for excellence within RTI that works across all the various groups at RTI as much as we can to kind of promote data science for good related things. So what we're seeing a lot of is that, kind of as you alluded to, traditionally a lot of the ways that you would analyze these kinds of data, most of the folks that we work with have a background in the social sciences and are very good, have a lot of insight into kind of research design, causal inference, things like econometric techniques to kind of draw those things out. And what we're seeing is that a lot of the data for good is being able to add an additional perspective to harness a lot of data that would otherwise be very hard to quantify. That was to give something more concrete example we did for the Bureau of Justice Statistics. This was around understanding the amount of police-related deaths in the US. It was a couple years ago. Basically, they're having, this data used to come about through traditional survey of law enforcement agencies. And as you imagine, this is a statistic that it's very hard to get honest self-reports on, and is also kind of fuzzy about what that definition means. And so there was often a lot of underreporting for when the statistics come back and they're ran and they're weighted and all that fun stuff. The numbers are way, way below something that you would see from aggregated counts from something like the Washington Post. And so basically what we did was we worked with the Bureau of Justice Statistics to come up with an algorithm to basically it's almost like a systematic review. We tried to find all the different, we set up keywords to try to get any article that could potentially relate to a arrest-related death. And then we had a machine learning algorithm to kind of filter down to unique events to come up with a more accurate count of what these arrest-related deaths were. And what was really nice about it is for initial quality check, to then have something that they could go to the police department and say, we found this record in the public record. We want you to confirm whether or not we got this correct or not. So there's an actual additional validation measure for data quality that was just not really something they could do with a survey. And so basically the numbers effectively doubled, and we had a really nice way of being able to get something that normally you wouldn't be able to get otherwise. We have a bunch of different kinds of examples that we're seeing all over the place, and there's a lot of interest from our clients in trying out these things, where I would say when our center started a few years ago, there was maybe a little more hesitation because they were less developed, but I think that there's been enough trust and groundwork that we're seeing a lot more of it, and it's been really great.
Very good. Thank you.
So I'd like to add an example from SAS perspective, because a huge focus is data for good and partnering with agencies to identify critical problems in society to help address them. And as another example that's been in the media over the last couple of years is the opioid crisis. And so we've recently been partnering with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to try to address the issue. Most of the research that has been done had always been on the subscriber side. But we're changing and working with focusing on Medicaid claims. And so focusing on looking at it and researching it from the beneficiary, the people who file the claims. And so what that allows is to partner with all of these organizations to look at individuals who might be at risk. And so if you look at all of the claims from, they go to one doctor and there's a claim and they prescribe an opioid, and they go to another doctor and so looking for patterns of oversubscription, looking for patterns of people who have repeat visits unnecessarily that's tied to something that should not be prescribing an opioid. And so that working, and that is something that's very important, because if we can make data-driven decisions to help prevent or flag someone who could be in crisis, or somebody who's headed for a crisis, to be able to identify that well in advance. And so not focused on treatment at the end, usually, because by the time you get to it, then it leads to treatment. How can we get ahead of that so that before it becomes a crisis, we can head it off and identify people at risk?
Very good.
I would just add one other thing, which I think often overlooked in the discussion about how analytics is helping society as a whole, is the fact that it's a fundamental contributor to things like fintech and legal tech and some of these other technologies out there that are making services available to more people than ever before, right? So fintech can provide loans and provide interesting ways for people to look at their investment strategies and things like that weren't simply available to those people before, right? Legal tech is the automation of a lot of legal processes, and some of the great work that's being done on that is providing people access to legal counsel that would not have had access to it before. And so I think that it. In a lot of ways, business analytics and automation together can kind of start to provide, in some cases, for-profit opportunities that actually make society a better place because they democratize this access that we did not have before.
Very good. Thank you. I would like to read a statement now from some of the partners at McKinsey Consulting. They say this: success with analytics requires not just data scientists, but entire cross-functional agile teams that include data engineers, data architects, data visualization experts, and perhaps more importantly, translators, data translators. So I'd like to ask each of you, do you agree with that statement? And if so, what other roles would you add to the list? So, Rob, why don't we start with you this time?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I guess anecdotally, like when I started in our center, well, I didn't start the center, but I was one of the first members of our center, and basically kind of like a startup, we had to do everything. And so I just felt like I was just bad at everything at the beginning, which, I mean, things got done and, you know, they were serviceable, but I think that really to have a high-performing team, you need people who specialize, and it's really unrealistic to be the unicorn. And even if you do happen to be good at everything, you're still going to be the bottleneck, because then you're the only one who can kind of do things, at least if you're trying to do everything yourself. So I totally agree with that statement that there's kind of a broader set of roles, and there's a lot of things that if you want a well-functioning team, like that's what we do in our center all the time. We've got you know, software developers and data engineers and data scientists all kind of working together, business experts. That list of roles, do they have a like equivalent of a business analyst on there?
Yeah, they call it the translator, which could be a product owner. It could be a lot of different labels. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that one's also extremely important, maybe the make or break role a lot of time on these teams, especially for new teams where they need to communicate a lot of their value and they haven't kind of established that value yet internally. That role is extremely key to getting everyone on the same page and understanding what the real business problems are.
Great.
Yeah, I would very much agree with what Rob says and what the statement as well. I mean, so I have a PhD in computer science, but I now teach marketing for a living, right? And so I'm quite used to like the engineering, sales, marketing divide, right? And I think the same is also true in a lot of business analytics decision making, right? Where there is people with the data who can say, oh, I can do all this great stuff with the data. I can manipulate in all these cool ways and find all these cool patterns. And then there's other people who say, yeah, but that's not what we need, right? We need something that helps me decide whether or not I should, you know, offer a cheaper price on this service to this particular customer, right? And so trying to really, I think that translator, that business professional, business analytics professional, right, in some way, is probably one of the most valuable parts of that, right? And I think along with that, there's a whole set of skill sets that other people can provide, things like visualization, right? Good, you know, quite frankly, good user experience design for a lot of these things, right? Internally, right? Like my salesperson isn't going to use the tool that helps them make decisions about how to approach customers if they can't understand how to use that tool, right? So you need UX people in there as well who really have the ability to work on these techniques, right? And so I think that really the best business analytics team is not a single person. Looking for the unicorn is impossible, right? Instead, you need to find a group of people who are best able to tackle the problems that your particular firm or organization is trying to solve.
Yeah, I agree. The translator is very vitally important, that role between the business and the people the technical people or analytic people. One thing that, one role that I do think is very critical is related to the people who are focused on preparing the data. So whatever the answers or the insights you want to gain, someone has to be the data people, the data analysts, the data prep, because as they say, 70 to 80% of the time spent when you're trying to do an analytic project is spent on prepping the data. And so that role is something that should not be undersold, because that has to be important, because whatever it is, it has to be prepared for to analyze it on the end.
Right. Very good. One last question from me formally, and then we'll open it up to the audience. But some scholars and practitioners have suggested that there is now a widening gap between understanding the importance of analytics and effectively applying it in an organization. So this is operationalism, right? So how do we operationalize analytics? And Bill, I'll start with you on that one.
Yeah, I definitely think that there is, there's been a lot of focus when people first start up a business analytics group, or they first start up a data analytics or data science team, or whatever they want to call it, on what I'll call discovery analytics, right? Where they take a bunch of data and they discover cool patterns in it, and they say, look, our customers are doing this, or the organizations where their supply chain is doing this, or there's these financial patterns. And that's all great and useful and helpful and can help inform decision making going forward. But really, if you really want to make business analytics a core part of your organization, you have to have another team, in many cases, that basically works on operationalizing that finding, right? So now that you've got this great insight that you found in this historical data, how do we take that and make that available to our sales team, to our frontline managers, to the people who are actually going to use that information? And how do we maintain that infrastructure on a regular basis, right? And I think part of that is also determining, when did those patterns change, right? When are our customers behaving in different ways than what we had originally found in that discovery analytics? So I think it's vitally important for a firm to not just look at discovery, but also to look at operationalization, to make sure that there's a coherent strategy for how the discovery analytics are going to translate into what I'll call operational analytics.
We refer to that as rinse and repeat.
Yeah.
So as rinse and repeat, you can do it, you can find insight, but the next time when you get new data that comes in, does that pattern, does that model, does it still work? We need to continually learn. It's to rinse and repeat. Put it in operation and then continue to evaluate whether it's effective or not. So I very much agree with what you said.
And Rob, as a data scientist, you might have unique insight into
Yeah,
this.
So I absolutely agree. There's a big difference kind of providing strategic kind of high level or even targeted things, and then something that's operational that needs to be up and deployed and available, kind of granular stuff available to people down the line right at your fingertips. And I think there's oftentimes a lot can be lost between that jump, and it always takes longer than you think it's going to take. So anyone who's trying to do this, like, reset expectations, because it's probably going to take longer than you think. I think the hardest part is oftentimes working with legacy systems, your IT systems, at least from a technical perspective, because a lot of them weren't built for the specific fancy models maybe that your data science team has built up, and then you have to go back to the drawing board and kind of find something that's more reasonable that can check all the boxes. And I would also say that the maintaining part is also a big challenge, and it requires a different skill set, honestly, than a lot of just like kind of statistical thinking and machine learning. The deployment process requires a lot of kind of very savvy DevOps and software development skills, which there's not always a huge overlap with the analyst skills.
Very good, thank you. All right, well, we have some students that have some mics that are going to bring the mic to you if you have a question. So I would love for you guys to just raise your hand if you have a question for one of our panelists, and one of the students will bring the mic to you, and you can ask them these burning questions that you've been waiting to ask. All right, here's a couple over here.
Good morning. So you were talking about working in an agile environment, which so many companies do today. continuous improvement, everything's time boxed. So in the interest of time, how do you know when you have enough data to make a decision?
I think that's a tough question to answer in the generic sense, right? I think it really depends upon the purpose, the question itself, right? In a lot of cases, and I think that one of the things I would suggest is trying to collect as much historical data as possible, obviously, so that you can start to look back and see if we could have made a decision differently using this model, using this analytic device in the past, would it have made a difference, right? And if you find that the answer is yes, right, then you at that point have enough data to start moving forward, right? If you find that the answer is, well, a naive model or a simple model that wasn't built upon all this data really would have given us the same amount of insight, then it may not be useful to actually proceed forward with what you're doing, right? But
yeah, I think it would be based on the criticality of the decision you're trying to make. If you're just, for example, trying to make decisions based on fashion trends that just, always changing or blending or whatever, versus if you're trying to make a decision based on an image of trying to diagnose cancer. The more those things, the criticality of making sure that that is a life or death decision based versus something that's not as critical. So that's kind of, I think, the more critical the decision and life-saving, life-changing decisions versus other types of decisions.
Yeah. And I'd argue that that oftentimes analytics can give you a direction and a hypothesis in which you want to then follow up with something more rigorous if you are worried that you might be tricking yourself into a conclusion that's not valid and run an experiment or those kinds of things. But I feel like, that's the amount of data is a good question. I'd also argue that a little bit of good, really high quality data probably beats out a ton of, trash data or whatever, like a bunch of social media data or something. They're different kinds of quality and what you're trying to get out of them.
Right.
Just one thing that Rob mentioned there I think is very important is hypothesis testing in the data and hypothesis testing in your analytics. I personally am sometimes a little skeptical of approaches that are more black box, that you can't really understand why the model or the analytical approach is giving you the result it is, because we've seen some examples of them failing badly. Google flu trends, for instance, started out as this great promise of this, we can predict the flu, and then within, I think it was about a year, it started over and under predicting by orders of magnitude what the flu was going to be, right? And they didn't really have a quick way to figure out what the hypothesis was, or what the result, why it was generating the results it was, because essentially they were using a very black box solution to understand what was going on. And so I think if you have a theoretical tie between your data and your result, then you can start to do things like hypothesis testing and really determine, do I have enough data to move forward with the solution I'm trying to propose.
Very good. All right, I think I saw another hand over there.
My question's around privacy. You mentioned the European Union and the UK having those laws. Do you see those expanding into the United States? And secondly, I'll give you a little funny story. Testing privacy once, my wife and I were talking about buying newborn diapers. And the only thing in the house was this on the table. Within 10 minutes, she got an ad for newborn diapers. We're in our 60s. There's no more babies in my house. Can you talk about privacy?
I was had an example like that this weekend. I was in Target. I didn't realize that Target was having their early preview Black Friday sale. So I walked in the door and was immediately inundated with texts and email about about the preview sale. So yeah, I understand your example totally. But whether I feel that those laws will expand to the U.S., I don't, it's so hard to say. I think we, as a country, are more, I want to say, the right of the individual is important, but freedom is also, and supporting industry and advancing technologies. I think that's going to be the balance of whether we actually will end up there. So I'm not sure. I really don't know. I think it's really going to be that debate as a country.
Yeah, well, California's already had this debate to some
Yeah.
extent, and they actually passed the California Privacy Act, which takes effect, I believe, January 1st, 2020. And and quite frankly, given the fact that it regulates Silicon Valley to a large extent, I don't see any way that it can't expand. I mean, it's not the same as the
It's not the
GDPR,
same,
right? Like there are differences.
Exactly. There are differences.
But to a large extent, we will be seeing privacy regulation roll out. The example of talking around the phone, of course, a lot of people have come up with similar examples. It's yet to be shown in any way that these phones are capturing things when we say they're not. But if it were to be revealed, I always say, but if it were revealed next month that they are, I wouldn't be terribly shocked either, right? Quite honestly, I think what people, when they talk about those examples, is they underestimate the power of association with these devices, right? So just because you're talking about newborn diapers in your home and there's nothing turned on or nothing around, doesn't mean that in any way they need that knowledge in order to start showing you ads, right? If you have children or kids or friends or whatever who recently had children, they can start serving up ads based on that pretty easily, based upon purely association, right? So a great example that I like to use is a group of my MBA students came up with a similar argument where they were all talking about how they had been talking about a particular type of shoe. One of the students went home, and on Facebook that night, they saw an ad for that shoe, right? And they're like, wow, I didn't type anything into my phone. I didn't look this up. I'm like, all it took was one of the 5 people in that room searching for that. And there's an induced social network that we can derive from what's going on that allows us now to start serving ads to you, right? And so that's all it takes. The amount of power in the data that we have around us right now is, I think, what's truly underestimated. Quite frankly, Google and Amazon and Facebook and all these companies, they don't need to be listening to you talk on your phones, because just the amount of data and information you're putting into these devices and the amount of connections we can draw to your friends and family allow us to start to infer these kinds of things.
Question right here.
I guess to piggyback on what he just mentioned, and I'm wondering, does this fit into the category of data integrity or data privacy? What do you think about certain places that we visit that require you or give you the option to use your fingerprint, and they keep that information on file, and how are they using that data going forward, and for what purpose are they using that? I'll give you an example, like Disney. I wouldn't allow my family to use the fingerprint, we use the card, but I was wondering, why are they doing that, and how can that data be used at a later time?
Well, essentially the reason why they're using it, I could start to answer that a little bit, is because the more we can tie data to you as an individual, right? These other data sources that I mentioned that are out there, it's a loose correlation, right? Like, I know that a friend of yours did this, and I think you're a friend with that person, but I don't really know, right? Whereas if I have it tied to a fingerprint, right, that something happened, I know 100% of the time that that's why it happened, right? Like, because there's, very little way that could be a duplicated fingerprint, right, or something like that. So as a result of that, that's why they're doing it. They're trying to personalize these experiences as much as possible, right, and kind of bring them to you. I think that, again, I go back to what I was saying a little bit earlier, that it really depends upon the relationship between the consumer and the firm as to whether that's okay or not, right? If the consumer feels like by giving them their fingerprint they're getting access to experiences, to benefits that they couldn't have before, then I think you'll see more and more people doing that, right? I mean, if you had told me, 10 years ago that everyone would be posting everything that they ate for dinner on Instagram, right? I don't know if I would necessarily have believed you in a public eye, but people do it, right? Because they feel like they get a benefit. In that case, it's purely social currency, right, that they're getting out of it. In the case of Disney, right, like, one thing they're doing with the Magic Bands, which aren't quite as evasive, is that when you leave the Small World ride now, it says goodbye, Rand family, as you're floating out, right? And so they give you a slightly more personalized experience in that environment. And to some people, I think that's going to be worth it.
Do you think it could ever be used for that, like to track if a criminal was there or like
Yeah, in fact, I don't know if you've seen that there's been some discussions about the genetic testing systems, right? And the fact that now police are using some of these genetic databases to try and nail down to identify criminals, right? And so if a criminal is dumb enough to then spit into a tube and send it off to, was it
23.
Right.
the ancestry or whatever, right?
Right.
Now they could help track it down. Now, is that a bad use? In that particular case, maybe not, but obviously it does spell for potential for abuse. So I think especially when it comes to genetic markers and to health markers, a lot more privacy concerns definitely come into play.
Yeah, they have been used, like in that example, to solve cold cases. And I guess misuse is there, it could be, but the advantage of, like, if your fingerprint and the crime occurred, and then just what is your right for Disney to have the information, and they are looking and researching and trying to determine who was there at the time to commit it, and ask for the personal records of what people were on what ride at any time. The potential, that's the privacy part, is how broad is the reach to ask, to subpoena that data, and what other information will come out of that investigation. So it is a very slippery slope that we have to, scope around.
And it is interesting that certain firms are actually competing on privacy. Like, I don't know, was it DuckDuckGo, for example,
Yeah,
a search
exactly.
engine? They're basically, their sales pitch is like, we're not gonna save your data. We might, serve other kinds of ads, or might have to charge for it, but like, we're not actually gonna do any of that. So if people are more concerned about particular privacy concerns, there are, market options for it. What's tricky about that is that oftentimes you have to pay for, for something that you might think that you should just have as a right anyway. And so that's where, there's maybe also room for legislation to find the balance.
And I think we had a question at this table right here. Yes.
So working in my data analytics class on different projects, we've been working in groups, and sometimes we come up with different insights and different results from our data. And I was wondering if that happens with you guys in the workplace, and how you guys deal with these kind of situations.
You would make a great tester, I would say. I mean, because I think that kind of is a good thing in some cases, because it forces you to really focus and ask the questions, as I said, the curiosity of why did we not land at the same place? What are we missing? Because clearly something is missing, either in the questions that are being asked, or the data is not clean. The quality of the data is not good, and you need to improve the quality of the data. So I think in some cases it's not necessarily a bad thing, but when that happens, I think it's important to step back and ask, why are we not getting the same answer? And what do we need to do differently? So that would be, speaking from a quality standpoint, that would be what I would look at.
Yeah, no, that definitely does happen. At least in my job, it definitely happens. And it's often, like as you mentioned, probably a good thing in the long run. It usually means that we either didn't form the question very well, and people are kind of interpreting things differently, or that that there's potentially more nuance to this phenomenon than we initially expected, and there's an opportunity to kind of articulate that and tell that story to our end user. So.
Yeah, I would just say from a scientific perspective, like, this is an argument why we should not be using black box models a lot of times, right? Like, so if I have two black box models giving me two different answers, I don't really have a good way to figure out which one's right? Whereas if I have two models that actually tie the data directly to the answer in some way that I can trace out the path, right, then I can look at the assumptions and hypotheses behind each of those models. And then from a scientific perspective, this is fantastic, because now I have two competing hypotheses about why things should go one way or the other, and I can try and set up experiments or set up different sets of models that would tease out why one of those is giving us one answer and one is giving the other, right? And that gives us new insights into how data affects business decisions, and I think that's very important.
I think we might have time for maybe two more, so maybe one here and one on this side of the room. Thank you.
I have a follow-up question regarding data quality. In school, a lot of times professor give us a perfect two-dimensional CSV data set that I can
Sometimes.
do. Sometimes. So we can do a lot of statistical modeling, regression, classification, whatever we want to do. But in real world, I've seen situations where the value in some attribute is very complicated in the form of list or dictionary, so we need to do some natural language processing to extract the data we want, or a situation where the data we want exists in the system, but it's not something we can extract out to a report, or it could be the value is mistakenly labeled in the system. So do you have any, do you agree this is the issue of the data ecosystem in the organizations? Do you have any suggestion like that? Thank you.
Yeah, I would say that every problem I've run into is more complicated than the problem sets that I got in in undergrad and grad school. Yeah, you're totally right. A lot of the data might have really complex data structure, like in nested JSON kind of things, where you'd have to, there's one-to-many like relationships, and you have to kind of either figure out ways to aggregate things up or kind of capture that branching pattern. And there's always, oftentimes there's things in the data set that, or the database, if you're just grabbing stuff from a database that probably didn't make sense to you, it was built for a different purpose, it's just wrong, And so I think having good relationships with the people who actually develop those systems and know it really, really well is like, that's a great way for you to not embarrass yourself. That's a really important relationship to have if you aren't that person. And I agree that's what's nice about uncovering those is that oftentimes, at least internally, when I'm doing stuff for the RTI business operations side, is I'll bring it to their attention, and then they're like, yeah, we got to fix this, and then we kind of just bring it to the attention that it's a potential issue, and showing the value of what you could do if it was fixed. Like, it's a great opportunity to kind of address some of these things that wouldn't be addressed otherwise.
Yeah, I would add from, since you mentioned from your school and educational experience, and I can put a little plug in here, we're actually currently working on a proposal to have a business analytics certificate that you can earn at the Poole College of Management. And one of the core courses that I said that we absolutely have to have for that certificate is what I'll call a data engineering course, essentially, right? That would teach the skills of how to bring in different data types, right, from text to images to whatever into a database, and then also on the back end, how to store those data in different ways, right? Because a lot of times using a straight up standard relational database that we were taught originally might not be the best storage format for some of these systems, right? So looking at NoSQL solutions, looking at Spark solutions, things like that, that kind of take these data engineering to the next step and allow us to kind of move beyond those traditional approaches, right? But I do think, I think you're hinting at a big part, and this was mentioned by Ada earlier, I believe, that like 80% of business analytics is actually cleaning the data and getting it in the right format to begin with, right? And I do think that we need to do a better job of teaching those skills at the university level.
I'm glad to hear that. That is great. That's awesome.
Okay, one question over here.
Hi, can you talk about some of the most common pitfalls to be avoided in the practice of data analytics? Would it be not having the right people on your team, or the tendency to confirm preconceived biases, or maybe misunderstanding the data that you're working with in the context in which it was collected?
I would say one of the biggest pitfalls is lack of a clear strategy. It's like starting starting it as a project as opposed to trying to know what it is that you want to get out of it. Like, what is the purpose of it? So lack of clear strategy to me is where, it's just from out the gate, is where things start. If you don't understand, if you don't have a clear vision of, it's like, why are we, again, going back to the 5 why are we embarking on this? What are we hoping to achieve from it? And what do we think we will gain from it? And then who needs to be involved? That, going back to the question of what are the roles, making sure we have the right people, the right stakeholders in the room when you're defining that strategy. And so to me, that is one of the key pitfalls.
Yeah, I would add on, I do think that confirmation bias is a pitfall to worry about quite a bit. One of the things that I insist, at least with my grad students, that they do before they ever apply a model is exploratory data analysis. And I think that's something that isn't like that. I think, if you teach someone data science, they kind of understand it, but if you teach someone just how to build a model, they'll go around and they'll, every problem is a nail and they have a hammer, and they'll just hammer it, and they won't bother to think about, is this the right model for this data first, right? So we often start by just graphing all the data out, like plotting it all out and looking at the distributions and seeing how can we analyze this, how can we tie these different data sets to this endpoint. And so I think that is, I think if anything, I would say that that's often a point of concern right off the bat. And of course, what Oichi mentioned as well also is very important. And I think that the lack of the right stakeholders is often what results in solutions that aren't effective for anyone. So I think that's an important thing.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, the stakeholders part is actually like pretty crucial, I think. Just managing expectations around, especially like sometimes you might come up with analysis or come up with a pilot or proof of concept, and what we always get, what we always used to get was like, okay, it's ready. Let's get this thing on the let's do it. And we're like, whoa, this is a prototype. Like, it hasn't been tested. Like, this is very preliminary. And so I think that communication piece, like, if you overpromise too early, you can get in a lot of trouble. In addition to all the other kind of technical nuances that you brought up.
Yeah, there was a great post on, I follow the data science subreddit, and there was a great post the other day that's about what they banned the phrase, "that looks simple," from their group, right? Because of the fact that, it never is, right? And it kind of is not good for expectations management if you constantly are saying that looks simple, right? And so just trying to make sure that you always have everyone involved and you're always willing to think through the full life cycle of the business analytic process rather than just how to build the first prototype is very important.
All right, maybe one last quick question from this side, and then if you continue to have questions after this, you can feel free to talk to our panelists afterwards. So one more.
Thank you. Appreciate you mentioning comments about soft skills. And I have a question that relates to sort of the organization aspects of companies using data analytics as part of their growth initiatives. What have you suggested or seen in companies that is and would be encouraging individuals to embrace uncertainty and change, and particularly related to innovation and ways to think differently and explore new ideas? What kinds of models or examples have you seen and used? As an example, I've studied and talked with folks about jazz and the patterns, the extending ideas and being more creative as a model that might be instructive for some teams.
Was the question, how do you make the business case for innovation?
Tied to innovation and help, sort of the building a culture of embracing uncertainty and change. And the analytics, on one hand, could reduce uncertainty in pieces, allowing risks in other areas, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah, I might. Oh, go ahead, Ben.
No, I think culture is important. I think one of the, and this is always easier said than done, is starting out with a culture of trust and transparency and allowing people to fail, and meaning that innovation requires exploration, experimentation, hoping for a positive outcome, but you can also learn from the things that don't work. And so there's equal learning in those, and that's where you refine. So I think the culture of the organization is important, and starting with, some things are better started from the bottom up as opposed to at the top down say thou shalt innovate. Is that I think it's creating that culture where people feel that have the freedom to explore, and that bubbles up. I really do, as opposed to I've seen examples where you set up a hub for innovation. These are the innovators. That works sometimes, but then those people are the innovators. But then you have 95% of the people where you're saying, we don't want you, that's not your role, but really it should be all of our roles every day to continually improve, to have lifelong learning. So that's really some of the things that that are important. Kind of some of the mantras at SAS is lifelong learning, curiosity. How can we come in every day to want to do better, to want to improve what we do?
Yeah, I would say culture is terribly important in these cases. I can definitely tell you what not to do, right? Which is what I'd call the hippo culture, right? Or not just me, many people do. Which is, where all opinions and all judgments are related to the highest paid person in the room, right? Which is hippo, kind of as an abbreviation, right? And that culture is exactly antithetical to an analytics-based culture, right? Because, and the hippo culture worked really well for a long time. I should say that, right? Like, they were the highest paid person because they made good decisions and they kept getting rehired and they kept getting new jobs and new opportunities. And they could make these complex decisions based upon intuitions and experiences they had in the past. But we know for a fact that humans are fallible and that we don't remember the past very well, and in fact that we reconstruct the past almost every time we talk about it. And so our judgments and our decision making is based upon some ideal world that doesn't actually exist in any real sense. Analytics culture is the exact opposite culture, right? It's the culture that says, to pair one phrase that gets thrown out here is, we trust in God and all others bring data, right? And so the idea is that, that you have to have the data to back up your decision making, to back up your judgments, to back up your experience. And so I think that, if you switch to an analytics culture, you need to do whatever you can to start allowing anyone who has the right data and anyone who has the right models to come forward and make a valid point in a meeting or an operation or a decision, right? Like the jazz, I like the jazz analogy, right? Like if someone comes up with a data set and shows a certain result, having someone else then be able to build upon that and come up with new data, right? Like that's, I think, a great way to kind of promote an analytics culture and to really move forward in that space.
Robin, your last thoughts about that?
No, I would just agree. Yeah, having the culture and then at the bottom up, but also, having the executive support also definitely helps. But that can come in a lot of different flavors, so it can't do just alone, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Very good question. Well, that concludes the formal part of our time together this morning, but I do want to encourage you to come up and meet our panelists and ask any questions of them after the event is over. I also want to encourage you to mingle with each other and use this time to network. A couple of quick things before we formally thank our panelists. Be sure to mark your calendars for April 2nd, 2020, and join us for our next event in the PNC Thought Leadership Series. It will be on the topic 10 Rules for Financial Security. So that sounds very intriguing. I want to invite you back for that. Let's give all of our panelists a round of applause for being here. Thank you.